The darkness has a new name, Occultic Abyss.
I used to think my life was ordinary. The kind of life where nothing extraordinary happens, where the nights are quiet and the only sound is the soft hum of my phone charging on the nightstand. I would go to bed, wake up, go to work, come home, scroll through social media, and sleep again. Every day was predictable, safe, boring. But ordinary can be deceiving. It lulls you into a false sense of security, makes you blind to the shadows gathering at the edges of your vision. It started with small things. A flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye that I convinced myself was a trick of the light. A whisper I thought came from the wind slipping through the cracked window. My house felt heavier, quieter, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. I brushed it off. I told myself I was tired, overworked, imagining things. But the ordinary life I clung to, the safety I had taken for granted, it was about to unravel. I didn't know it yet, but something had already begun watching me. Something that had been patient, biding its time, waiting for me to notice. And when it finally made itself known, my ordinary life would end, and nothing familiar would remain. Because once the darkness finds its way into the mundane, there's no going back. I remember the night it all began, the night the ordinary life I clung to cracked, revealing something darker beneath. I had just settled into bed, the kind of quiet night you think is safe. My apartment smelled faintly of cold air and leftover dinner. The lights were dim, shadows pooling in the corners. I remember thinking, nothing could disturb this stillness. And then it rang. My phone, sitting on the nightstand, vibrated with a sharp, insistent buzz. The screen showed an unknown number. I frowned. I never answered numbers I didn't recognize. I stared at it for a long moment, telling myself it was just a wrong call, a telemarketer, maybe a prank. But there was something wrong. Something in the vibration itself, irregular, almost deliberate, like it wasn't just a message, it was a signal. Against my better judgment, I answered. The line was silent. Just static. The kind of low, grinding static that presses against your ears and crawls under your skin. I said hello. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft at first I thought I had imagined it. But it grew clearer, clearer, until I could hear the words, my name. My blood ran cold. Who would know I was home? How could anyone know? I shook my head and laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was someone playing a joke. I hung up. The phone screen went black. Silence returned. My heart pounded, echoing in my ears, but I told myself it was over. Just a prank. Just a wrong number. But it wasn't over. Minutes later, the phone rang again. Same unknown number. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to throw the phone across the room. But something, fear, curiosity, a mixture of both, made me swipe the answer. This time, the voice was clearer. Low, distorted, like someone speaking through broken glass. I couldn't make out the words fully, but I recognized a pattern. It mimicked my own voice, my own breathing. The way I said hello, it repeated it back to me. Exactly. I dropped the phone. My hands shook. I lit a candle, the flickering light casting tall, unnatural shadows across the room. And then, I noticed them. Shadows that didn't belong. Shapes moving just beyond the reach of the light. Flickers of black, retreating when I looked directly at them. My apartment, my familiar, safe apartment, had turned alien. The calls didn't stop that night. They came in bursts, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes with long, torturous pauses. Each time I answered, the voice got closer, more insistent. Whispering secrets only I should know. Asking questions I couldn't answer. It learned me, my habits, my fears, the way I sat, the way I breathed. By the end of the night, I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't moved from the bed except to clutch my phone, praying it wouldn't ring again. But it did. Always it did. And I realized, this wasn't random. This wasn't a prank. This was a warning. A message. A promise. Something had found me, and it wanted my attention. And as I lay there, staring at the black screen, listening to the static, I understood one terrifying truth. The ordinary life I had known was over. The first strange call was not just a call. It was the beginning of something far, far worse. Something patient. Something hungry. Something that would not stop until it had my full attention, my full soul. I didn't know it yet. But by the time dawn crept through the blinds, I would already be trapped in a nightmare that had no escape, guided by the voice on the other end of the line, the caller from hell. After that first night, I thought things might calm down. I told myself it had been a one-time event, a wrong number, a prank, my imagination running wild. But as the days passed, I realized something horrifying. The strange calls were only the beginning. It started small. At first, I noticed subtle shifts around the apartment. Items slightly out of place, things I was certain I had set down differently. A glass on the counter moved an inch. The curtains drawn tighter than I had left them. The air felt heavier, like something unseen was standing just beyond my vision. I told myself I was imagining it. But then, the calls started again. At first, they were silent. The phone would light up with the same unknown number, and the screen would flicker, buzzing faintly with static. Sometimes, the line would go dead the moment I answered. Other times, the static would deepen, grow thicker, almost tangible, pressing against my ears as if the air itself was vibrating with a warning. Then the voices came. Not just whispers anymore, but fragmented sentences. Broken phrases I could barely understand. And always, a familiarity, words I had thought were private, thoughts I had only spoken to myself. The voice knew me. It learned me. Every morning, I woke with the phone vibrating in my hand, even when I hadn't touched it. Even when I had left it across the room. I tried to escape it. I tried to leave the apartment, but the calls followed. On the bus, on the street, even at work, my phone would ring with that same, unknown number. I would answer, and all I would hear was the low, distorted echo of my own voice, repeating my words back to me, faster, sharper, mocking me. And it wasn't just the phone. The shadows began to shift in impossible ways. Reflections in mirrors would linger a moment too long, the shape behind me remaining even when I turned. Doors creaked when no one was there. The apartment felt alive, and it was watching me. I began noticing patterns. The calls always came when I was alone. The shadows always moved when I wasn't looking. The whispers were synchronized with my heartbeat. My life, the ordinary life I had once known, was being rewritten in real time by something patient, calculating, and relentless. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the phone ringing. I imagined the dark corners of my apartment extending, curling, reaching for me. Even the walls felt like they were breathing, contracting, and expanding, like some unseen lung preparing to consume me whole. I stopped eating properly. I stopped leaving the apartment. The world outside seemed distant, unreal, a fragile barrier between me and the creeping horror inside my home. The calls became bolder. They started to punctuate my days with menace. Sometimes, they didn't just come through the phone. Sometimes, I would hear the same distorted static in the kitchen when I wasn't near the device. Sometimes, a whisper would follow me into the bathroom, repeating the smallest things I had said seconds before. I felt stalked by a presence that was learning, adapting, testing me. One night, I swear I saw it, a shadow flicker at the edge of my vision, too tall, too fluid to belong to any human or animal. It paused, watching me as I stared, paralyzed, phone in hand. Then it vanished. And I knew, without a doubt, that the caller was no longer just a voice. It had a shape. It had intent. And it was becoming bolder. By the end of that week, I no longer dared answer my phone. I let it ring, unanswered, hoping that silence would protect me. But silence offered no refuge. Every vibration in my pocket, every soft buzz from the charging cable, every flicker of light against the wall, it became the same voice, the same warning. I was trapped in a web, invisible, unrelenting, and entirely my own. I didn't sleep that week. I didn't eat. I barely breathed. The world had narrowed to my apartment and my phone, and every moment, the presence that had found me grew stronger, closer, smarter. It was no longer just a call. It was a siege. And as I lay in the dark, heart hammering, I realized something that chilled me deeper than anything before. I could not escape it. Because the stranger on the other end was learning me. And whatever it was, it wanted more than my attention. It wanted everything. By now, I had stopped questioning whether what I was experiencing was real. I knew it was. I could no longer convince myself that the shadows were tricks of light, or that the whispers were my imagination. There was something here with me, and it was no longer content to remain hidden behind the veil of ordinary life. It had begun to reveal itself, in subtle, terrifying ways that made my heart beat faster even when the room was silent. The first sign came with the mirrors. At first, I didn't notice it. A delayed reflection, a flicker of movement that didn't match my own. A shadow lingering where it shouldn't. But soon, I could see it clearly. Something crouched behind me, just out of focus, in the reflection. It mimicked me sometimes, moving when I moved, breathing when I breathed, but never fully revealing its form. A presence, aware, patient, watching. I would turn quickly, and it would vanish. Every time. Always vanishing. Then came the voices. Not through the phone this time, but in the air itself. Whispered phrases at first, unintelligible, like wind rustling through dry leaves, but sometimes, I could hear my own name. Sometimes, words I had never spoken aloud would escape my lips only to return to me, distorted, strange, malevolent. I would wake in the middle of the night, the apartment silent, only to hear faint, urgent murmurs emanating from the walls, from the ceiling, from the dark spaces just beyond my vision. Objects began to move. Slightly at first, a cup on the counter shifted an inch. My keys weren't where I left them. My phone slid across the table without explanation. And then it escalated. Books would fall off shelves in the dead of night. Chairs tipped over. Drawers opened, revealing nothing, yet I knew something had been inside them. I began to feel a presence whenever I approached certain parts of the apartment. A chill, a prickling at the base of my skull. A sense that unseen eyes were observing every move I made. The air itself felt wrong. Heavy, thick, pressing down on me. The lights would flicker in patterns that mimicked my own movements, like some twisted game. Sometimes I would walk through a room and hear faint footsteps behind me, always stopping when I turned, echoing through the apartment as though someone, or something, was pacing me, following me, toying with me. One night, I woke to find a shadow standing in the doorway of my bedroom. Not human, not fully formed. A dark, shifting silhouette that pulsed with intention. I froze, heart hammering, breath shallow. It didn't move, but the weight of its gaze pressed into my chest. Then, slowly, it began to reach toward me, stretching in impossible angles, its edges flickering and breaking like smoke. And then it was gone. The doorway empty, the air still, my body trembling uncontrollably. The supernatural wasn't subtle anymore. It left marks. Scratches along the walls that I didn't make, cold spots in places my skin hadn't yet touched, whispers that turned into sentences that chilled me to my core. Names, dates, phrases I didn't recognize, yet felt uncomfortably familiar, as though the entity knew my life better than I did myself. And the phone. Oh, the phone. It no longer just rang. Sometimes it lit up with numbers I didn't recognize. Sometimes it displayed words, messages that vanished when I tried to read them. Sometimes, it called me, silently. No ringtone, no vibration, just the black screen illuminating my dark room with a pale, unnatural light. I would pick it up, and all I would hear was breathing. Slow, deliberate, and sometimes, mine, echoing back at me, warped and broken. By now, I was trapped in a nightmare that had fully crossed into the supernatural. I could no longer ignore the signs. The shadows, the whispers, the moving objects, the impossible reflections, they were all telling me the same thing. Something had claimed my space. Something had marked me. And whatever it wasn't human. And yet, even with all this, I felt compelled to understand it. To watch. To wait. Because the calls, the shadows, the whispers, they were intelligent. They were teasing me, testing me, learning me. And I knew, with a terror I couldn't shake, that if I didn't answer, if I didn't confront it somehow, it would only grow stronger. Waiting. Watching. Patient. The ordinary life I had once clung to was long gone. And the reality I was left with, the one I was trapped in, was no longer mine. It belonged to something else, something dark, something that had stepped out from beyond the veil of the natural and claimed me for its own. By now, the warnings were everywhere. Subtle at first, and then unmistakable. Friends and family tried to reach me, telling me to leave my apartment, to throw the phone away, to stop answering the calls, to forget about the strange shadows. Even strangers seemed to sense it. There were moments, fleeting and terrifying, when people would glance at me in the street with a look of unease, as if they could see the presence trailing me, wrapping itself around my life like a dark, suffocating shroud. But I ignored them. I couldn't stop myself. Part of me, the part that had once been rational, cautious, wanted to flee, to hide, to burn the phone and forget it all. Yet a stronger, more stubborn part of me whispered, I have to understand it. I have to know what it wants. It was curiosity, hubris, or perhaps stupidity. I had stepped too far into something I didn't understand, and I refused to turn back. The calls became more frequent. Not just during the night, but during the day. I would hear the vibration in my pocket when no phone was there. I would see numbers flash across the screen that didn't exist, combinations of digits that made no sense, yet seemed to carry meaning. And each time, I answered. Always I answered. I told myself I was searching for answers. that I was learning. That knowledge would protect me. But the warnings grew more sinister. Shadows began to move even when I was looking directly at them. Objects would fall just inches from me, narrowly missing, as if mocking my refusal to leave. My reflection in the mirror would linger too long, eyes that weren't mine staring back, accusing me of my arrogance. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, they became clearer, almost articulate, repeating my own words back to me before I spoke them. Every time I tried to walk away, to ignore them, they grew louder, sharper, relentless. Even the air seemed to rebel against my denial. It grew thick, heavy, cold. Breathing became a labor, my chest tightening as if something invisible were pressing down on me. Doors creaked open on their own. Lights flickered in rhythm with my heartbeat. I would glance toward the windows and see shadows moving in the darkened streets outside, though I lived alone in a building that should have been silent. Warnings also came in dreams. Each night, I fell asleep in exhaustion, only to awaken in visions where the caller's voice was closer, sharper, whispering secrets I hadn't spoken aloud, forcing me to confront truths about myself I wished I didn't know. Each morning, I awoke with marks on my skin that weren't there before, scratches, bruises, traces of some unseen force reminding me of its reach, of its patience. And still, I ignored it. I told myself the ordinary rules of the world still applied. Phones were phones, shadows were shadows, whispers were nothing. I clung to reason even as the reality around me dissolved into nightmare. I believed that by understanding it, I could control it, harness it, or at least survive it. But the warnings were not idle. They were precise, deliberate. Every flicker of light, every whisper, every impossible shadow was a message: leave, or pay the price. Yet I refused to heed them. I was stubborn, foolish, blind. By the end of that week, the line between warning and threat had blurred. The apartment no longer felt like a safe space. Every corner hit eyes. Every reflection mocked me. Every sound, every vibration of the phone, was a pulse from something alive, something aware, something waiting. And I, in my pride and defiance, had chosen to ignore the warning. I had invited it in. And as the night deepened, as the shadows stretched long and impossibly across my apartment, I felt it, closer, tangible, patient, and merciless. It had learned my limits, my fears, my stubbornness. And it was about to teach me exactly what happens when you ignore a warning that comes from beyond reason, beyond life, beyond everything. The caller had been patient. But patience has limits. And now, my defiance had reached its end. Ignoring the warning was no longer an option. The consequences were coming, and they would be absolute. I knew the warnings had been real. I knew the whispers, the shadows, the impossible movements of my apartment were not figments of my imagination. I had tried to ignore them, defy them, reason with them, but that night, it no longer waited in the background. That night, it stepped into the light, or perhaps it dragged the light into its darkness. It began with the phone. The unknown number flashed across the screen with a ferocity I had never seen before, red-hot, pulsating, like it was alive. My hand shook as I reached for it. I wanted to run, wanted to throw it across the room, but curiosity, fear, and some terrible fascination forced me to answer. A voice came through, low, distorted, and unmistakably human yet impossibly wrong. It spoke my name, not once, but repeatedly, like a chant, a mantra, echoing from the depths of some place that should not exist. And then, it knew me. Every secret, every fear I had tried to bury, every thought I had never spoken aloud, it recited them as if it had read my mind, as if it had been inside me all along. I gasped, but the voice only laughed, a sound that curdled the air, vibrating through my bones. I dropped the phone. It landed on the floor and continued to ring. Not through the device, but through the room itself. The sound seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. And then I saw it, a shadow stretching along the far wall, taller than any human, impossibly thin in some places, impossibly thick in others. It moved with a predatory grace, edges flickering and breaking like smoke. And it was coming for me. I ran, but the apartment had changed. The layout felt wrong, hallways longer, corners deeper, shadows curling around me like fingers. Doors slammed shut, locking me in. Lights flickered, then died completely, plunging me into darkness so complete it was almost tangible. My own breathing sounded deafening. Every step echoed unnaturally, as though the building itself were amplifying my terror. And then it spoke again. Not through the phone this time. Not through whispers. Its voice filled the room, resonating inside my skull. You should have listened. The words were calm, deliberate, but the weight behind them crushed me. It was not yelling. It did not need to. It was stronger than that. Its presence pressed against me, bending the air, freezing my limbs. I could feel it, see it, sense its intent. And it wanted me to understand something, or perhaps to break me. I tried to fight, to push back, to run, to resist, but every instinct failed. The shadows coiled around me, stretching into impossible shapes, pressing at my chest, clawing at my mind. My phone lit up again, casting a sickly glow across the room, and the screen showed my own reflection, but twisted, malformed, eyes black, grin impossible. I screamed. The scream echoed, but it wasn't entirely mine. Part of me was somewhere else, watching, trapped, helpless. Then it touched me, or maybe it didn't. I can't tell. Something slammed into my senses, an invisible weight, a burning cold that tore across my spine and left me trembling. I fell to the floor, gasping, and the shadows receded slightly, almost giving me a moment's relief, but I knew it was only bait. Only testing me, teaching me, learning me. I crawled across the floor, desperate, terrified, praying, begging. The voice returned, softer now, almost intimate. You are mine. You are mine, and you do not yet understand. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This entity wasn't just haunting me. It wasn't just calling me. It was inside me. Every thought I had, every instinct, every heartbeat, it had access. It had control. And this first confrontation was not a warning, it was a lesson. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, the apartment was silent again. But I was not the same. I had survived, barely, but I knew the real terror had only begun. The caller had made its move, and I had felt the weight of it. My life, my mind, my very soul, had been touched by something far older, far darker than I could comprehend. And it would return. This was only the first confrontation. Only the beginning of a war I hadn't agreed to fight. And deep down, in the darkest corners of my being, I knew the caller was waiting. Watching. Learning. Patient and relentless. After the first confrontation, nothing was the same. The apartment no longer felt like mine. The shadows no longer waited in corners. They moved freely, stretching along the walls, creeping into spaces I had once considered safe. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating, carrying whispers that I could not ignore. The caller had broken through the fragile barrier between ordinary life and something else, something ancient, patient, and infinitely cruel. I tried to resist. I tried to reclaim my life, to go about my routines, to pretend the entity hadn't touched me. But every step I took, every breath I drew, reminded me that I was no longer alone. The phone vibrated constantly, even when it lay untouched. Sometimes the screen glowed with numbers that didn't exist. Sometimes it showed my reflection, but warped, twisted, as if I were already being replaced by something else. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the shadows pressing closer. Sometimes I would feel cold hands brush my skin, though no one was there. My dreams became nightmares, looping, relentless, showing me visions of myself trapped in impossible spaces, watched by a figure that knew every fear I had. And I began to notice small things in waking life that I could not explain. Faint scratches on the walls, objects moved without my touch, doors slightly ajar that I had closed. The caller's voice was everywhere. Not just through the phone anymore. Sometimes, it would echo through the room, low and distorted, murmuring my name, repeating my thoughts before I had them. It seemed to follow me, anticipating every movement. Every attempt to escape was met with subtle, terrifying interventions, a shadow crossing my path, a floorboard creaking as I walked, the faintest whisper brushing my ear. I stopped eating. I stopped leaving the apartment. The outside world became unreal, distant, almost irrelevant. My entire life narrowed down to one terrifying reality. I was being hunted, stalked, and studied by something I could neither see nor fight. Even my reflection betrayed me. Mirrors no longer showed what I expected. Eyes that weren't mine stared back. Faces shifted, grinned, and disappeared. I began to hear things through the walls. Footsteps pacing, sometimes matching my own heartbeat, sometimes slower, deliberate, almost ritualistic. And every time I tried to confront them, they vanished. I realized then that the caller had transcended the phone, the apartment, even the laws of reality itself. It was everywhere. It was patient. And it was learning me, piece by piece, mind by mind. By the fourth day of complete isolation, I was trembling constantly. Shadows clung to me like living creatures. Every corner of the apartment seemed to pulse with life I could not recognize. The air smelled faintly metallic, like blood I couldn't see. I felt cold seeping into my bones. And through it all, the phone continued to call, incessantly, though I dared not answer. And yet, I was compelled. Something in me, some foolish, terrifying part of my own mind, told me that the only way to survive was to answer, to face it again. But each vibration, each flash of the unknown number, carried with it a dread that made my stomach turn, a knowledge that every call was a test, a manipulation, a lesson in fear. By the end of the week, I could no longer distinguish between waking and dreaming. The shadows moved whether I slept or woke. The whispers followed me wherever I went. My reflection was no longer my own. And I knew, with a terror that made my chest ache, that I had descended fully into the realm the caller controlled. There was no longer hope. There was only fear. And that fear was mine, entirely, completely, inescapably. I was a prisoner in my own life, trapped by the unseen, hunted by the voice on the other end, spiraling into a darkness I could not escape. The descent was complete. And the caller waited, patient, always waiting. It came in the dead of night, as if it had been waiting for the deepest darkness, the perfect moment when I was most vulnerable. The phone rang, and for the first time, I felt a pulse of dread so intense it froze my blood in my veins. The screen glowed with the unknown number, bright, angry, alive. I knew it was the final call. The one I could not ignore, could not escape, and could not survive if I failed. I stared at it for what felt like hours, paralyzed, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The air in the apartment had become oppressive, thick with an unnatural weight, vibrating with something unseen. Shadows coiled along the walls like living snakes, stretching toward me, then recoiling, teasing me. My hands shook violently as I picked up the phone, knowing that on the other end awaited something that had studied me, stalked me, and learned every fear I had. And then it spoke. The voice was no longer distorted, no longer hidden beneath static. It was clear, precise, intimate, impossibly close. It knew my name, my thoughts, my memories. It recited secrets I had never shared, fears I had buried deep in the darkness of my own mind, moments of shame and terror that I had tried to forget. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to throw the phone across the room and run. But I could not. I had become its audience, its plaything, its prey. The walls began to shift. The shadows stretched impossibly, wrapping around the furniture, pressing into the floor, curling along the ceiling like some living organism. The room seemed to contract, shrink around me, forcing me closer to the phone, closer to the voice that promised everything I feared. Every flicker of the lights, every movement of the air, every creak in the floor sounded like a countdown, a rhythm keeping pace with the terror in my chest. And then I saw it. Or them. I cannot be sure. A figure formed in the corner of the room, a tall, impossibly thin shadow, darker than the night itself, edges flickering like dying embers. Its eyes glowed faintly, red, patient, and it smiled. Not a human smile, not even a familiar one, but a predatory, knowing grin. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. You cannot hide. You cannot escape. This is the end. I screamed. The sound echoed in the apartment, bouncing off walls that seemed to stretch further than they should, reverberating through the empty air like some ancient, cruel chamber. The figure advanced, folding the shadows around itself like a cloak. The phone continued to ring, each vibration rattling my bones. I could hear breathing, my own, warped, twisted, but there was something else too, something alien, something alive, stalking the edges of my mind. I tried to fight, to resist, to pull away. But every motion was slowed, every breath stolen. The room became a maze of darkness and whispers. The shadows multiplied, stretching across walls, floors, and ceilings, filling every corner with movement that shouldn't exist. My reflection in the phone screen shifted again, showing me a version of myself I did not recognize, eyes black, skin pale, mouth twisted into a grimace I had never worn. I realized with a chill that it was not a reflection, it was a glimpse of what would happen if I failed. The voice whispered again, low and intimate, brushing against my mind like a cold wind, "This is the final call. Choose, or be claimed." My hands moved almost on their own, gripping the phone tighter. The shadow advanced, flickering, stretching impossibly close, and the air grew colder than any winter night I had ever known. I could feel it pressing against my chest, forcing my knees to buckle. My vision swam with darkness and light, reality warping, bending, twisting. twisting, until I could no longer tell where I ended and the presence began. Then, in one instant, it all stopped. Silence. The phone screen went black. The shadows recoiled. My breathing returned, shallow, ragged. For a moment, I thought it was over. I had survived. I had escaped. But the apartment was not empty. The air still carried the memory of its presence. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor seemed tainted, holding the echoes of the voice that had reached into my mind. I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that it had not left. It was patient. It was waiting. And it had marked me. The final call had come, and I had answered. But survival had not freed me. The darkness had claimed its place inside my life, inside my mind, and I knew that nothing, no light, no sound, no rational thought, would ever undo what had been begun. The caller from hell had revealed its power, and now, I was trapped. Trapped in fear, trapped in shadows, trapped in a nightmare that would never end. And as I sat there, staring at the black phone in my trembling hands, I realized the worst truth of all. The call had ended, yes, but it would ring again. And when it did, I would have no choice but to answer. Morning came, or what I thought was morning. The sunlight that crept through the blinds was weak, gray, almost hesitant, as if the world itself knew something had changed. My apartment was quiet, eerily so. The shadows that had stalked me, whispered to me, toyed with me, were gone. But the absence of sound, the absence of movement, was worse than any presence. It was a vacuum, a hollow that echoed with the memory of what had happened. I looked around, half expecting the furniture to move, the shadows to pulse again, the phone to ring. But it lay silent on the table, black as obsidian, as if nothing had happened. Yet I knew better. The marks of the encounter remained. On the walls, faint scratches I could not remember making. On the floor, scuffs, like footsteps that were not my own. And in the air itself? I could still feel it. A weight. A pressure. A presence that lingered, patient, unseen, waiting for its next opportunity. I tried to call it a dream. I tried to convince myself that exhaustion, fear, and paranoia had woven a nightmare too real to distinguish from life. But I could not. Every sound made me jump. Every flicker of light made my skin crawl. The apartment, once ordinary, had been transformed into something alien, something hostile. And I understood that no explanation could ever undo the terror I had endured. The phone did not ring. Not yet. But I could feel it watching, always watching, in ways that made my chest tighten and my thoughts twist. Every thought I had, every movement I made, seemed to ripple through the apartment like a signal to something unseen. The caller had left, in body, perhaps, but never in essence. It had claimed a part of me. A part that would remain forever tethered to its darkness. I wanted to leave, to flee the apartment, to escape the place that had become a cage of shadows and whispers. But even outside, I felt it. I could feel its gaze in the corners of my vision, in the reflections of windows, in the empty streets. I realized with horror that the ordinary life I had known was gone, and nothing could restore it. I had answered the call. I had survived, but survival was only the beginning of a different kind of horror, a horror without end. And so I sit here now, phone in hand, shadows at the edges of my room, whispering faintly in voices I almost recognize. I know the caller waits. I know it will call again. And I know that one day, if I answer, the darkness will not let me go. The ordinary life is gone. The first call, the strange calls, the shadows, the whispers, the confrontations, all of it led here. And what remains is a single, terrifying truth. The caller from hell does not rest, does not forget, and does not forgive. If you ever hear a number you do not recognize, if your phone rings in the dead of night, do not answer. Ignore it. Run. Hide. Because the caller waits. Always. And when it calls, it will claim you too.